Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Robert Swartwood here. Tonight, I am joined by New York Times best-selling and Bram Stoker Award-winning author of such novels as Road of Bones, Snowblind, Red Hands, and the recent The Nightbirds. Um, as an editor, he has worked on the short story anthology Seize the Night, Dark Cities, The New Dead, as well as one of the most anticipated anthologies of the year, and some might even say decade. The End of the World as We Know It, New Tales of Stephen King's The Stand. That's right, it's your favorite writer and mine, Christopher Golden. Chris, how the heck are you?
You say that to all the writers.
You know what I
Um,
do, but I mean it here.
I'm doing very well, thank you. How you doing?
Yeah, well, living the dreams, trying to stay busy. So
You know, I'm
let,
in like I'm in that like last month and a half coming up on the novel that I'm currently writing, and
oh
so
no.
my office is a total disaster. I don't know if other writers are like me, but when you get in the weeds, like one of the things that happens is when I finish a novel, I'm like, oh, now I can clean my office.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Let's just talk about, I guess, the little bit of the process here. Are you a writer who, as you are kind of on the downslope, you can just start doing, like hours and hours and hours at the computer, where you are just like knocking out like, and again, I mean, we're kind of jumping ahead with things, but like typically, how much on a regular day are you writing? Are you trying to get done? Do you have like certain word count that you try to hit,
Um,
or do you have
so,
certain like
so
pages?
it used to be much more regular, but now, so currently I owe short stories for anthologies. I owe comic book scripts. I'm working on the screenplay for the adaptation of The House of Last Resort, which was my previous novel, and I'm writing the next novel. So, it's a juggling act. And so, what I would say is that usually the afternoons, if not the mornings, when I'm working on a novel, are given over to the novel. Um, so I try to get 4 or 5 hours in on a novel in the afternoon, and on a good day that could be 3,000 words. On a bad day it could be 1,500. It depends how many interruptions I have and what else is going on, um, and where I am in the book because it goes faster as I get closer to the end.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, as you get close to the end, you really are kind of just feeling it more. So okay. Well, let's talk a little bit. You have a Wikipedia page, and every time an author has a Wikipedia page, I like to comb through it and do a little bit of like a Rich Eisen, celebrity true or false. Although there isn't really too much to kind of get from your Wikipedia page in terms of at least some
Yeah,
like juicy tidbits. But one of it says he graduated from Tufts University. True or false?
that is true.
What did you graduate? I mean, like, what was your degree in?
My degree was a double major in English and history, and that was actually creative writing and European history, and a minor in classics.
Okay, so you knew pretty early on. I mean, you went to college specifically for writing. Let's talk then about, do you remember how old you were when the first like creative thing you did? Any like even like short stories in schools, poems, drawings,
The
anything like
one, the
that?
one that I remember like most clearly was actually fan fiction. Probably the only piece of like actual fan fiction I've ever written. Um, and I was in middle school, probably early middle school, and I sat down and wrote a story that included Doc Savage and Robin Hood and a TV character called, I think he was called the Master, played by Lee Van Cleef on a TV series. Um, and like, I don't know, I think that was him. Anyway, and a few other characters. And I only wrote the opening scene, which is like they're all on a plane together and they crash in the jungle, and. Um, but that was the first time I sort of, you know, uh, sat down and toyed with the idea of writing.
And so around that time, you were reading, obviously,
Oh
like I
yeah.
mean, is there specifically the stuff that you were reading that you were being inspired by?
I don't know. I read everything, you know. I mean, I've always been a massive cinephile. I've always been a massive fan of episodic television. And as a kid, you know, comics and books. Like I remember the first time I read The Outsiders, and that was Then This Is Now by S.E. Hinton. I remember in the fifth grade being obsessed with a book of Norse mythology called Thunder of the Gods. It was like a kid's version. And I took that out of the school library like 15 times or something like that. And so I was constantly reading, like sitting in class you know, when we were having lunch or whatever, the other kids in the class would be doing whatever they were doing. And a lot of the times I would be just sitting there reading.
So did you, I imagine because for a lot of writers, kind of with the same type of progression as you had had so early on, that you probably have a specific time where you felt you really knew, okay, this is what I want to do with my life. I mean, do you remember like was there a certain time or like how old you may have been where you realized like, oh, I want to do what these, you know, what these other writers are doing?
I I knew which writers I was in love with, um, and I just was constantly reading. But when I went to college, or before I went to college in high school, I was planning to go to film school because I love movies as well. And I wanted to go. Pardon me, I got a little tickle going on. But anyway, I wanted to make films, and I thought, well, I know that this is a very sort of treacherous industry. It's the chance of failure is incredibly high. So let me go and get the best education I can possibly get as an undergrad, and then I'll go to film school as a graduate. Um, but when I was in college, I started taking creative writing classes. I also took a screenwriting class in college. I took like a film study class, but I took 5 semesters of creative writing. And while I was a senior in college, I started reading a novel by John Skipp and Craig Spector called The Light at the End, which was their very first novel. And the best thing about that book, and the reason I think it sort of sparked in me, is that it's so of its moment, it's of its time, it's colloquial. And so I'd grown up reading authors who were older than I was, and John and Craig were older, but not that much older. And so what I was reading from them was very contemporary, and the storytelling was very relaxed and very young. And I'd written a bunch of short stories at that point, but that book made me think I could do this. And if I could write 18 short stories, there's no reason why I can't write 18 chapters because a chapter has a beginning, middle, and an end. So it was the first time I thought not only I could write a novel, but I could do this. I could do what they do. And so that was senior year in college, and it became my focus at that time.
But you had gone into, I mean, so was your, when you went into college, you initially though did have that creative writing in mind, or did that come kind of after the first year or two
No,
where
my
you declared
intention
that
was just
major?
to get a great liberal arts education and to go to film school, as you know, to go out to California, go to USC or UCLA for film school, for a graduate school. So no, it wasn't. I mean, I had always been writing. You know, in
Yeah.
high school, I wrote short stories, none of them good.
When was
And
the first time you got published with a short story? I mean, did you have a first, was your first, were you first published as a short story writer or was like a novel your first thing that got
so,
published?
ironically, kind of both. And the story behind that is my first novel of Saints and Shadows, which I started my senior year in college. Um, Included 2 sort of lengthy flashback interludes about the origin of the main character, who's a vampire who was he's the bastard son of the last emperor of Constantinople, or of Byzantium. And the editor who bought the book, Ginger Buchanan, uh, basically said, "You've got to take these things out. They stopped the book cold both times. You know, you should sort of take the best bits of them and have them as like a memory, but stop, don't do this. And I was like, okay. So I took those lengthy interludes and turned them into one short story. And I actually sold that short story to Death Realm magazine, which was Mark Rainey's magazine at the time. So my first short story came out before the novel, but the novel sold before the story.
Okay.
Uh,
Well, that actually
but
leads
it was
into one of my
years before
other.
I considered myself a short story writer.
Right. Well, I mean, you're a writer, just obviously you write different things. And that leads me into, one of my normal questions is your first novel your first novel or your first published novel? And clearly for yours, that was actually your first novel because
Was
for a lot of people, they all their first novel sometimes is like their fifth or tenth novel that they write, and sometimes it's
yeah.
not just because it's necessarily a quote unquote, the previous novels were quote unquote bad novels. It's just again, there's the way publishing works. It's just finding that right editor at the right time in the right market. And but okay, so how old were you when that one was published?
When it was published,
Or
I
yeah. When you sold it or public, I mean, yeah, it's like what, a year or two
I
out, but
sold
like when
it.
around.
I sold it right after I turned 25, or right around when I was 25, and it was published, I think, shortly before I turned 27.
And then at that point, were you kind of all in where you knew that, okay, this is definitely my goal?
Yeah, I had a phenomenal job. I was living down in New York at the time, um, with the job that I had out of college, which was an amazing job. And I made a 2 book deal with Berkeley, and I quit my job. My wife Connie and I she had moved down there um, at the time, and the deal was when she moved down, okay, I'll move down, but when you sell your first novel, we're coming back. So that was it. I quit my job, and I never looked back. So I've been full time freelance for 33 years.
Which, that can be scary at times because it is so unpredictable. It's not like having a day job where like, okay, this is how much I'm going to be getting every week, every 2 weeks, or whatever the pay period is. I mean, you might have a good year, you might have um, months and months and months where there's just nothing coming in. So I'm sure that was not, that can be really stressful for a lot of writers then too, where you
It's
just,
incredibly
really get into
stressful.
your head about things and just feel like you're just not, I'm not good enough and stuff like that.
It's still stressful, and it's still a roller coaster, like a constant roller coaster. And there've been at least 4 or 5 times in my career that I've started looking for a real job, as they call them. And then something has come up, and I've been like, okay, I'm back in. Um, Tim Levitt and I talk about this all the time, and I refer to it as shaking the trees. You get to that point where you're like, oh shit, I've got, however many, I've got a few months of money, and then there's nothing. And so then you've got to be out there shaking the trees to get something going. And if you look back at my career, there are only 1 or 2 things that I kind of wish I hadn't done, but the variety of things I've done, most of which I loved, is because I've been full time freelance for 33 years, and I've got a family, and I've been taking care of that family. So
Yeah, I mean, you are, and I know in the green room we were talking about how we could spend a long time probably just going over every little bits of your career because there is so much. How much have you, how many books, like, have you lost count at this point of how many novels or how many books or projects
um,
you've
if
published?
you'd asked me before, I could have opened a file and looked, because I do
That's
have a
okay.
file
It's
that
okay.
says it. But if you add up all of the books that I have written or co-written for various age groups and in various genres, and the nonfiction and the graphic novels, not including like floppy comics, um, and anthologies, it's like 130 something.
Jeez. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, let's go a little going back to your Wikipedia page. There was another thing that said that you worked on the 2019 Hellboy adaptation, though ultimately you were uncredited. True or false?
True. Um, I also co-wrote the most recent Hellboy movie, The Crooked
which
Man.
you are credited on.
I am credited on. Yeah, the David Harbour Hellboy movie. Um, I defend not the movie, but um, the movie it could have been all the time because I mean the quick story is that Mike Mignola did not like the script that they had at all, and so I came in and wrote two drafts of a very different script. At the time, it was still, and this is something people don't really know, but it was still a sequel at the time. Um, then they decided that it wasn't going to be a sequel; it needed to be a reboot, and they came to me and they wanted me to rewrite it in like 2 weeks or something like that. Um, and they didn't want to pay me to do that, firstly, and which, whatever. Uh, but I had just rented a house in Maine for a week with my family that I had paid for, and I was like, you definitely do not need this in 2 weeks. Um, and I'm going to Maine, so the answer is no. And they insisted that they did need it right away, and so I was like, sorry. So that's why I didn't continue working on it. But I'm actually kind of glad I didn't keep working on it because um, two very talented writers, Aaron Collette and Andy Cosby, both worked on it over the course of the next X number of drafts. Andy Cosby did, I think, a ton of drafts on that movie. And the final shooting script of it is actually a really good movie. Um, you know, I think that the final version that through all of that turned out to be, I think, a very good movie. And I think that if you went back to everything that was shot for that movie and had a different editor and somebody else handling the control of the music, I think there's a really good movie there. And I think David Harbour did a really good job. But the finished product as it was released is not a good movie.
So they wanted you to do drafts, but they weren't going to pay you anything?
Well, I had been paid for the drafts I did.
Okay. I was going to be like, yeah, who do you find is I guess cheaper, more New York publishing or Hollywood with things, that they
Well,
really
I
want
mean,
to do it.
the difference there, my friend, is that uh, Hollywood has to contend with the Writers Guild. So there are rules about how little you can pay somebody. If there weren't, believe me, they would be, you know, probably worse than publishing. So,
Yeah, yeah. So, what have you written any? Because obviously you talked about you're working on the adaptation of
The House
what
of
was
Last
the
Resort.
yes, the House of Last Resort. How many adaptations have you done of your works? And I mean, and you find it at this point, it's something that you can step into pretty easily because I mean, you're taking a 300 page because I was just watching like Tony Gilroy's out there on the interview circuit because of Andor, and he was always talking about how for the longest time he views just regular movie scripts as like a short story. He's like I'm a short story writer for the longest time, but now I get to write a novel because he was doing 2 seasons and he didn't really have to have. He was always saying that, like, when he's writing, he's always keeping an eye on that page number in the corner because
Mm-hmm.
you can only get to a certain page and then it's like, okay, this is already too long. So you're taking like a 300 page novel and essentially you're condensing down just the main parts that create what the novel. I mean, I don't know, like, how do you approach adapting your work and
Well, so
versus any original scripts
yeah,
that you've done?
I mean, none of the things that I've done so far have been made, unfortunately. But I have I mean, the people I'm working with on this, Michael B. Jordan and Liz Raposo, are amazing. And I'm hopeful that this will get to the finish line. But the process on this one is really interesting. You're right. I mean, it's very difficult, especially because um, as a screenwriter, I come into it as a screenwriter, not as the guy who wrote the novel, even though I am the guy who wrote the novel. So I come into it immediately and think, what does this need to be a good film? and what does it need to have removed to be a good film. And a lot of novelists and prose writers, like freak out about the idea that you're going to, eviscerate what they did, but I'm doing it myself. So um, the first job is to figure out what can go and what should go, but also what does it need to make it a good film? Because that is a separate question. So the process is definitely difficult. And I wrote a treatment for it, so it has a sort of a beat by beat outline, which is too long. And I'm in the process of writing the screenplay, which what I have done so far I like, but what I have done so far is definitely too long. So my intention is just to finish it and then look at how ridiculously overlong it is and figure out what to do about that. Um, because I think that's the only way, that's sort of the process that I have to go through, is to then figure out, what do I have to sacrifice? What could I do in a different way that would allow me to get the same effect or to get the same moment? What characters can be combined with each other? All of that.
Yeah.
Um, but it's definitely easier to write an original screenplay for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I find with novels, oftentimes your characters can be very verbose because, obviously, I don't know, I think there's part of, in our heads, okay, well, novel has to be a certain length, so it's just like, okay, we can have them talking back and forth. But obviously with films and TV, like actually I think it was Andor or something else I was watching recently where I just was really noticing just how tight the scenes were and how these characters essentially we're only saying like a handful of lines to each other, and that was the entire scene. Whereas opposed to in a
Right.
novel, you would probably have it like 5 pages of just a conversation back and forth, where
Right.
they were really going down to just like what is, and it's almost I wouldn't say like necessarily like poetry, but in a way it is, where it's like every word of dialogue is needed, and like there's not an extra word at all in there. I guess for the good scripts and screenplays at least.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I feel like, what I'm trying to do here is get to that point where when I'm going back through it, I will look at every line like that. But part of it also is it needed for character? Is it needed for the tone of the scene too? Right. On the one hand. On the other hand, you have to just trust the actors. You have to trust the director. That they're going to get what you are asking for. So I think that a lot of times, if you're overwriting, if I'm overwriting, it's because I'm paranoid. Like, I want to make sure that the points that I'm trying to deliver get across. And then part of the challenge when I'm going back through it is going to be reminding myself, okay, the actor can do that without saying it. The director can do that without the actor saying it. So that'll be interesting.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's definitely things that you can do in film TV that you can't do in a novel, and also vice versa. I mean, there's obviously things you can do in a novel that you can't really do in a film TV because there's stuff that you have to take into consideration too, where, as a novel, you're like, okay, they're in New York City and they're walking down the street and there's like thousands of people around. Well, in a movie, they're not going to be able to do that because they can't afford all those extras. They can, they might have to like do with whatever else. So let's talk about well, we are already up about a half hour in, so let's talk about the Chris Jameson novels. Well, yeah, where are those? I'm sure you get asked about these all the time. Yeah, like, well, let's talk about Shark Island, Devil Shark, Shark Beach. I mean,
Yeah,
where
nobody
did the
asks me
shark
about those.
obsession come from?
So it's so interesting. So all right, so uh, during one of those times, and I was shaking the trees, right? Um, my editor had asked me. My editor at St. Martin's had said, they wanted to try to do something, some kind of shark thriller, something shark, like a great beach book. Did I have any ideas? And I said, I got nothing, because I had nothing at the time. And then months went by, and I was sitting with a writer friend, Nicholas Kaufman, at dinner at New York Comic Con, I think it was, and we were talking about it because he'd also sort of thought about trying to do something, and we talked about maybe doing an anthology of shark horror, whatever. And we were talking about how we just didn't have anything. And then after that dinner, of course, that night, because I was thinking about it, I had that epiphany moment that is so often the thing that comes to the rescue. I had an idea for Shark Island, which was the first book that I wrote as Chris Jameson. Um, and I emailed my editor the next day and said, "Are you still looking? Here's 3 paragraphs about what I would like to do." And he came back and said, "Yes, and this sounds fantastic, and let's let's do that." So that turned into 3 separate Chris Jameson shark thrillers. The first one, Shark Island, I think is actually really good. I love that book. The other two are fun and I hopefully action packed and interesting. I don't think they're as good as the first one, but I think they're fun. Um,
So whose idea was it for the pen name? Was that the publisher, or were you basically like,
I
let's do
don't
this under a different
remember.
name?
I definitely was not going to do these books under my own name, and they were totally fine with that. I don't remember if they asked me to not to, or if I said it. But in any case, it was definitely not something I was going to do under my name because we were trying to build a certain amount of momentum under my name with the books I was doing for them in hardcover, and these were going to be paperback originals, and they're very sort of subgenre. They're very different from the stuff that I was doing and am doing normally. So, yeah,
And so we know where Chris came from, obviously, but where Jameson come from?
my father's name is James or was James, so I'm Chris James' son.
Very, very nice. So when you're writing a novel like that, that's just basically very, you know, pulpy fun.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that you're able to knock those out? Well, and in the same vein, and I'm sure you probably have a novel. I think we all have a novel where you wrote it, you have like the Stephen King Running Man wrote a novel in a week type thing. I mean, for me, I did a first draft when I was in college or just out of college, like, not 90,000 words in 3 weeks. Like, because like I got to a certain place where I was just like, okay, I just want to keep going, keep going. I mean, how fast, with an initial draft, have you written a novel?
Ever?
Yeah.
Um, that's a good question. I used to be much faster than I am, or than I am now. Hold on one second. I'm sorry. Uh, and
Are you checking the score?
yeah, no, I'm not checking the score. My daughter texted me with an urgent question, so I've now
Oh,
heard
yeah,
her.
no, take it.
No, I think the first novel I wrote took me like 4 years, and the second one took 4.5 months. Um, and I'm slower now than I was, but for a while I was doing, several books a year. Oh, excuse me. And I think that probably the shark books took about 10 to 12 weeks each. Probably 12 weeks, like 3 months each. Um, but when the very first Buffy the Vampire Slayer novel that I worked on, which was with Nancy Holder, was very short. I don't remember how long, but it was meant to be YA at the time. It was probably 65,000 words. Um, and when we pitched them, they came back and said, "We want this one. We like it a lot. Can you do it in 4 weeks?" And we said yes, and we wrote it in 3.5, because we really wanted to do it, and that was it. But it was a lot shorter, and there were two of us.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
you've collaborated with a lot of different. How many people have you collaborated with at this point? Can
I
you,
don't know.
no idea?
I don't
So
know.
I'm assuming you enjoy collaborating because you've done it so often, or like if you had to, right now, gun to your head, pick one or the other, would you prefer to, just continue collaborating for the rest of your life, or do you just
Oh
want to
no,
write
I would do my own
novels
book. A
on your
thousand
own?
percent, I would do my own books. Look,
Yeah.
I've said for decades, writing is a solitary occupation, and I'm not a solitary person. Although weirdly, the older I get, the more solitary I become. Um, but uh, there's something to be said for playing with your friends, and so when something comes up, so a lot of times it's that the idea came up in conversation with a friend, you know, and then it's natural to do it together. And sometimes it's that you just would like to work with somebody, um, or I've been approached. I did a trilogy of graphic novels, original graphic novels with Charlene Harris, and that came about because Charlene asked me, and I adore her and think she's absolutely brilliant. And so, of course, when it's like I tell people all the time that you know uh, it's like the scene in Ghostbusters. When someone asks you if you're a god, you say yes. Can you do this? It's like actors who lie about being able to ride horses or fence or speak French. Sure I can. If it means give me the job, of course I can.
Yeah.
Um, do you have time for this? I do.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, I've been really lucky to be able to do some things that were really cool. The one
Well,
that's sort
so
of, go ahead.
yeah, no, no, no. You were
I
about
would
to
say
say
the
something.
one that's sort of the most unknown is that when Troy Nixey directed the film of Guillermo del Toro's Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, the remake of the 70s TV movie, I wrote, Guillermo asked them to bring me in, and I wrote a thing called Blackwood's Field Guide to Dangerous Fairies, which is both a prequel to the movie and a field guide to dangerous fairies. Um, and that was a blast, that was, but it's very expensive on the aftermarket.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about process. Do you are you somebody who would typically outlines, or you just kind of have that idea, that character, and just kind of hit the ground running?
Um, it depends on the project. Usually when I'm collaborating, I will do more of a significant outline. But when I'm writing an original novel, I do whatever amount of outline is needed to persuade the editor to buy it,
Yeah.
um, which usually doesn't have a whole lot of third act in it. Um, and so those documents can be anywhere from like, you know, 7 pages to 15 pages or something like that. And I I change a lot as I go, um, especially because I never really know the ending. Like the book I'm working on right now, which presumably will be out next year. I just had this 2 nights ago. Thank God it happened. I had this massive epiphany at like 11 o'clock at night and came in and wrote an outline, like scene by scene outline of the last probably, I don't know, 70 pages.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So typically when you're sitting down, I don't know. I always use that Harlan Coben kind of way to explain it, where it's like you're on a road trip. You know where you're starting, you know where you're going to end up, but you don't really know how you're going to get there, what's going to happen along the way, so stuff like that. So like, do you at least have an idea of like what the ending might be? And obviously that might change as you go. Or are there times where you're like, I really still don't even know, like, how we're going to end this 50, 100 pages
Uh,
out.
so often I know where it's going to end, but not how.
Hmm.
Um, so, for instance, with the Nightbirds, I'm not going to obviously give away the ending, but with the Nightbirds, the whole second half of the book, you know, I knew where it was going to take place and the circumstances under which it was taking place, but what was going to happen to the characters and how it was going to end and all of that, I had no idea. Um, and hopefully my editor doesn't watch this because it might terrify him to know how often I do that. But I really believe that for me at least, the less I know about how specifically I'm going to end the story, the better the ending is going to be, because it means that if I don't know how it's going to end, it's, I think, much more difficult for the reader to predict how it's going to end. Because in the scenes that would normally give that away, the writer doesn't know.
Yeah. Well, let's talk
So
about the Nightbirds. You have a copy of that there for people to see?
yeah, I do. Yeah. Let me see.
There it is. And this just recently came out. Yeah. So what can you tell us about this the newest book?
Um, it's uh, it's mostly, well, it's set in Galveston, Texas. Most of it actually just off the coast of Galveston on a half sunken, rusted out 100-year-old freighter that's so rusted on the bottom that a sort of forest of mangrove trees has grown up through the inside of the ship, as you can see is illustrated there. And which is actually something I stole from real life. It's actually in Australia. I thought that was fascinating, and one of the main characters, Charlie Book, is works for the Texas Department of Wildlife, and he's sort of studying that mangrove ecosystem that has been created on the ship. There's a tropical storm. He's living on the ship, and he's going back out to the ship at night just before the storm really kicks off. And in the parking lot, he runs into his ex-girlfriend Ruby, and a woman he doesn't know, and a baby. And Ruby says, basically, can you bring us out to the ship, the Christabel, and basically hide us for a couple of days? They're on the run, and what they're on the run from is pretty terrible. And it's a group that I refer to in the book often as the Nightbirds, and they want that baby. So that's the nutshell version of it.
So right now you are you're an author who at least is publishing one novel a year. Obviously you do other
Right.
projects or whatever else. How many like how many ideas do you have like kind of just stored away either in the back of your noggin or like do you write them down? Because I'm sure, obviously like you're probably pitching your editor, like, okay, I can write this book or this book. I mean, like oftentimes, how many times are you, you've had a lot of novels recently that have been optioned for film. I mean, are you thinking of ideas that could also, not also be great novels, but also have great film potential? Is that something you also take into consideration?
Not really. I probably should be, but I'm not. For instance, the novel I'm writing right now is set in 1953. So uh, I wrote that at a time, or I started writing and I sold it and pitched it at a time when the idea of a monster story set in 1953 was probably not the best thing to do. But I recently saw Sinners, and I'm wondering if a period piece involving flesh-eating, blood-sucking monsters might actually be a good thing now. But by the time the book comes out, who knows? Um, so yeah, I don't know. I just don't. Usually what happens is I'll send a couple paragraphs about two or three different book ideas to my editor, and he'll say, "Give me an outline for this one." And I'll do that, and that's generally what the book we end up doing. Um, I
And then
also
in those instances, how detailed is that outline? Is it mostly just a little bit more of expansion of a couple pages, or they want like beat by beat, Because I had an editor recently where like, okay, who's the killer? And I'm like, I don't know. I'll figure it out when I start writing. Like I just know that there's going to be a killer.
right, yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that's what I mean. Is that so often my third act is very sketchy. I used to years ago. I would write pitches that ended with, and then the shit hits the fan. Until finally, an editor of mine was like, "You cannot. I can't get my boss to buy a book that where the pitch just has that." Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't know. So when he comes back and says, "Give me a fuller pitch for this," and I've given him two paragraphs or three paragraphs, usually that'll be, like I said, anywhere between 7 and 15 pages, depending. Whatever I need to work it out in my head. Um, and yeah, I mean, there's just, but as far as the number of ideas, I used to have way more than I have now. Um, I think for a whole variety of reasons, not least of which is I'm older. I don't have there are ideas that I have things in my files that are ideas that I've had for 30 years, 20 years, 5 years that have been sitting there that I probably will never write. But the older I get, the less interested I am in some of those ideas.
Yeah.
So they're just sitting there. Um, I mean, some of them I think are really good ideas, but I'm no longer really interested in writing them. So a lot of times what happens is when it's time to come up with the next thing, I'll go back and look through my files and then I'll be like, I don't like any of this right now, or none of this is what I feel like doing right now. And then I'll come up with something completely new, which is what I did with the novel I'm writing now.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about let's talk about this book Tin Man, which you gave me this copy.
Sure.
We were at AuthorCon a couple months back. I was at a table next to you and your lovely wife, and yeah, you gave me a copy because I had an eye on it because I'm more of a thriller crime writer type thing, and this
Yeah.
was right up my alley. It was pitched. I think it says on there like Brad Thor meets Avatar. Very very high concept, and I remember when this came out, it was like that's a different book because I think of you, I think okay, horror, and this is obviously very high concept like thriller. Like, can you kind of talk a little bit like where was the idea where you decided to kind of like take that off ramp to try something new, and then under your name, it wasn't like okay, I'm gonna do this under a pseudonym. It's like I'm gonna do this under my name.
Yeah. Well, every time I've done something different, there's always a conversation about whether or not it should be under my name. Um, I would have been happy to do this under a pseudonym, but at the time they determined that bird in the hand, the readers that did know me who would cross over were more valuable than starting from scratch. But in any case, I have been like my whole career, I have done things in multiple genres. But as I said, like the horror people are my people. Horror is home for me, um, and it's where my heart really is. But I love all kinds of things. I love all kinds of books and movies and um, genres, and so I have ideas that belong in other genres. I have a couple of things. Half the time I think I should try to take this outline that I wrote for a science fiction, like big science fiction thriller, and sell the outline to somebody because I'm never going to write it. But suffice to say, in this case, I was at a time when I was just trying to sort of get something to catch, and I talked to my agent at the time about a few ideas I had, and he loved the idea for Tin Men, which I did too. Um, and interestingly, I've seen some influence. There's an interesting story about what happened afterwards, but I wrote probably the first 120 pages of it. And we sent that out with an outline, and we had an auction for the sale of it. I can't remember, like several publishers were interested. And we sold it in like 12 different countries, and Warner Brothers optioned it for a movie, which was a mistake on my part to option it to them. But I can elaborate on that if you want. Um, but basically, then the book was supposed to be the lead title of that month, and at a certain point, I guess the sales department decided they would have an easier time selling in big numbers for a different book that was also coming out at the same time. And so the budget that had been allocated to promote my book was diverted to another book, and it just was popped out there, and so nothing happened with it. But I just I still love it. I loved writing it. I had so much fun. Um, and I think conceptually it's really interesting. But the thing I was going to say is, we could talk about the plot if you want, but I was doing a convention, and I had these two people come up, and they were like, oh my God, we love this book so much. And they're talking to me about it. And they said, yeah, it's going around our whole department. And like, what do you mean? What department? And they said, oh, we work for the Department of Defense. And I was like, what? And they said, yeah, they worked for a division that was uh, about ethics. and their whole department was reading this book to talk about the ethics involved in the use of robotics in combat, um, which I was fascinated by. I wish that it hadn't been a PDF that had been being spread around and that the whole department had bought the book, but it was still pretty cool.
Yeah.
Obviously, no one in the current government is concerned with ethics, but you know.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, that kind of, I was wondering that too, if that was something that you had sold on spec, where essentially when you write the entire novel, because I don't know about you, I kind of find sometimes it's hard when you write the entire novel trying to sell that, because then people get a little more picky and they're like, well, I don't really care how this ended, as opposed to, here's the idea. Um, but something that's interesting, and I want to talk a little bit about like when it comes to research, I mean, like this takes place a good place, at least again, I'm only like halfway through, but it's in like Damascus. I mean, like when you were setting your books in certain places, like how much are you researching and how much are you letting that kind of also get in the way? Because sometimes I kind of feel like some writers, they do so much research that they like spent all this time and they don't want that time to go to waste. So they like kind of like try to push everything into the book to say like, oh, this is how
Yeah.
smart I am. Where it's like, where as opposed to like, I don't get that impression in Tin Men, but like it's that idea, but you still want it to obviously be, true to life and accurate at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, look, as screwed up as the internet is now, and uh, as a tool, it's so much less useful than it was even 5 years ago. Um, but it still is an extraordinary uh, tool for research, as long as you know that you're not reading something invented by AI. So for me, I used to go to the library and read books to educate myself about something I needed to know. But over time, I'll talk to experts or I'll talk to people who know a specific thing that I need to know. And I usually find those people either through contacts or online. And then I'll research certain topics and I'll go on Google Street View and I'll actually look at photographs of areas or neighborhoods or whatever, and I'll read about what people eat and all of that, just to try to create this sort of air of authenticity. Um, but at the end of the day, I feel like my job as a writer is to fool you into thinking I know what I'm talking about, right? And so sometimes when I talk to, like when I was doing the shark books, I talked to um, this guy who's probably one of the foremost experts on sharks in, at least in the country, if not the world. Um, and he was great. He was really helpful. But he comes back and he's like, well, this wouldn't be. And I said, listen, I don't need to persuade you. I need to persuade everybody who doesn't know what you know, right? It'd be great if I could persuade him. But so, for instance, with Ararat, my novel Ararat takes place on Mount Ararat, which one side of which is in Turkey, and that's the side that I'm working with in the novel. I was interviewed by two national Turkish newspapers, and both of the people who interviewed me in Turkey assumed until halfway through the interview that I had spent time in Turkey. I've never been to Turkey. I would love to go, but I've never been there. And and so to me, that's a huge win, right? So that's what I want with, like, I've never been to Syria. I don't think people reading this book are necessarily going to think I have been, but I don't want you to get caught on something. I don't want you to sort of stumble over something unless you happen to be somebody who has a vast knowledge of the thing. So, for instance, there's a lot of military stuff in the book. I've never served in the military, but I had my late and dearly departed friend Weston Oakes, who was a career military man, read the book and give me some notes on it. And he thought, in general, I had done a pretty good job. He gave me there were probably 10 or 12 "you're a dumbass" notes that he had me fix certain things. And the biggest one would have been incredibly humiliating if I had published it as it was written originally. Because stupidly, again, it was a draft and it was intended to be read by people who would be able to correct this. But um, the people guarding the embassy in the original draft of the novel were Army, and the
Mm,
Marines guard embassies
right.
always. And so it would have been a huge embarrassment, and anyone who was involved in the military in any way would have known that. So those are the kinds of mistakes you can't make.
Yeah. Although at the same time, I feel like it's not, it's also a different type of reality. You could get away with it and saying like, well, it's in the future. Things would have changed. You
Yeah,
could
but it
have
was
gone
only,
around it.
if I'm not mistaken, I think that in the novel it happens in 2025.
Oh, does it?
Or maybe not. Maybe it was, might have been 25 years from when I wrote it.
Yeah. Well, so shoot, what was I just gonna say? What was I gonna ask you? I'm completely blanking right now. Something that we were talking about. Um, yeah, well, again, I mean, again, it's very, very, very fun novel, very different novel from, what you had, from what, again, you typically do, because again, I think of you and, it's just like, okay, it's, you're a horror author, which again, there's nothing wrong with. I mean, look at like Paul Tremblay. I mean, he started out writing those two crime novels, but essentially now
Right.
he's more horror. But oh man, what was I gonna ask? Oh, that's right. So you're not one of those fancy writers who like, will then take trips and like, okay, I'm gonna go swim with the sharks to do my research, or I'm gonna like, because sometimes I see it's like, my God, it's like that must be nice.
I'm much more likely to I I do travel. My family loves to travel, and I have been fortunate enough to be a lot of different places. Um, and the places that I go do tend to end up in what I've written. So, for
So then
instance,
that
the
way you
House of
can write
Last
off the
Resort.
trip.
Sorry.
So then that way you can write off the trip.
Well, that certainly is a perk for sure. Uh, but the House of Last Resort takes place almost, yeah, entirely in Sicily, and I've been there several times. My wife's family is Sicilian. She's 100% Sicilian. Her parents were both born and raised in Sicily. So it's not all that's personal experience, but also research. There's also research that goes into it.
Yeah. So besides the Nightbirds just came out. Obviously you have the Stain anthology coming out later this year. You're working on a new novel, ideally that's going to be coming out next spring. Do you have anything else coming out this year? Any like short stories? Anything else for
Uh,
people to keep an eye out on?
I actually have a bunch of short stories I'm writing this year for anthologies that probably will be out next year. But I would say just to, if you don't already read comics, you should immerse yourself in comics because I also do write a lot of comic books. The current comics coming out, there's a 2-issue miniseries currently, Lady Baltimore, The Daughters of Medusa. And I think next week is the first issue of a new miniseries in the Hellboy in Love series that I write. Um, and let's see. I think those are the ones that are current. So,
So let me ask you quick, in the time we have left, when you're writing comic books, because
oh, I left
yeah,
out Frankenstein New World. Sorry. Go ahead.
oh, okay, and is that a comic then, or is that a?
Yeah, no, it's a comic. Frankenstein New World is and Hellboy in Love are both in the Mignola
Oh,
verse.
okay.
They're in that Hellboy universe. Yeah.
So when you are, like I guess it is one thing to write like a screenplay for TV film as opposed to when you're writing a script for comics because you can do different things with the comics, like the way the windows are, the splash pages, or whatever else. Like when you, I don't know, like do you, like how do you do that process? Do you kind of like in your head, or like do you kind of like maybe sketch it out and like, okay, I want this page to kind of look like that. So when you're writing the script, you can kind of make it clear to the artist how you want it set up, or is it just so much at this point in your head that you kind of
Yeah.
really know, like because you read some of these comics, it's like it's very unique on like how they're doing the windows or whatever else and the
I
panels.
mean, I would say that writers should be aware that every different medium is its own discipline. Writing TV is different from film. TV and film are very different from comics, even though people think they're the same. Um, Writing for audio drama is very different from writing for that. So, and obviously prose is different. So it's all very different, each from the other. But with comics, I describe, page one, panel one, and I describe what's in the panels. But I don't ever, when I started out, I would do this much more often. But now I just sort of trust in the artist that they're going to design the page in the best way, and that the size of the panels and how they flow. You have to rely on the artists. You have to trust what they're going to do. Of course, I'm incredibly lucky in that I work with extraordinary artists, so I can have that trust. But yeah, it's a very different medium.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you've also done the audio plays. That's something that I've been kind of dabbling in recently. Especially like Audible does a lot of those because when you're doing those, I mean, it's all sound. I mean, you have to just not.
Right.
It isn't just characters talking back and forth to each other. I mean, it's basically kind of like the old school radio dramas, like the ones that Orson Welles would do or whatever else. I mean, you would have sound effects, you have whatever else, and you have to take that into
Yeah.
consideration. So, like when you approach a project like that, again, do you? I guess again, if gun to your head, do you have a preference on like which type of medium you like doing? Besides, I mean, we're going to keep like the pros out of it, like when it comes to comics, script
I mean,
writing, audio writing.
they all have their own joys. They all have their own pitfalls as well. But um, I will say that Amber Benson and I wrote and we co-wrote and co-directed this 9 episode Buffy the Vampire Slayer series called Slayer's a Buffyverse Story for Audible in to 2023, I guess. And that experience was incredible. So the best part about that experience was working with the actors and being in the room and working with Amber and directing the cast. Because then that you're going to get, when you're writing a screenplay, um, you're being interpreted in a way that is beyond your control. And if you're writing comics, again, you're creating something that's being interpreted beyond your control. But being able to write and direct, you still don't control the actors. You have to trust in what they're doing. But sitting in the room, you can tell if an actor is not fully understanding the intention of the line. And so you can explain it better, or you can change the line while you're sitting in the room. So many times I just said, try this line instead, so that you can get the effect that you want in a way that you can't if you're not directing it.
So for that radio or for that audio drama that you did, because I've worked with Audible with some other stuff, and I know that, and I've done a lot of live streams with some narrators too. Like sometimes when they're doing these, they're just doing their lines separately, and then an editor or producer or whatever, then kind of mixes them all together. In this instance, the entire cast was in the same room together.
Almost the entire cast. We had um, some of the sort of actors who appeared in smaller roles and cameos and things like that. We recorded earlier. Like Danny Strong came in and did a cameo, which was amazing and hysterically funny. And so we recorded Danny's cameo earlier. But most of the cast was in the room every day while we were recording. And Anthony Stewart Head, who played Giles, was in London, but he was live from London. So he was being recorded live with our cast in Los Angeles.
Yeah, no, it's nice because then they can play off each other, and so it
Exactly.
doesn't maybe otherwise the dialogue might come a little stilted or might not feel completely natural as opposed to because and it's very rare because that costs the studio like money to be able to have that studio space and then bring everybody
Yeah.
in. So that's really cool. So I don't want to keep you much longer, Chris. I appreciate your time. Let's talk real quick again. The Nightbirds is out. It's in bookstores. It's in hardcover, audiobook, ebook. Do you have any other upcoming events for the book?
I will be with Clay McLeod Chapman a week from Friday, a week from tomorrow, so the 30th, uh, at in Bangor, Maine. And then the next day, we will both be at Galacticon, which is in a neighboring town. I'm sorry, I wasn't prepared to answer that question. And then I'm going to be at an event at Doylestown Books later this year. Um, and I just don't have the calendar in front of me, but I got to figure it
That's
out.
okay. Yeah, I sprung it on you. That's all right. So if people wanted to stalk you online, where's the best place they can do that?
Listen, I'm on Facebook. I am no longer on Twitter, but I am on Blue Sky and Instagram. So those are the places you can find me. I'm very easy to communicate with, and I'm always out there. I'm either talking about my books, talking about movies I've seen, or I'm talking about politics.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Again, the author is Christopher Golden. The new book is The Nightbirds. You want to hold it up real quick for people to
Yeah.
see? That there is the cover. So yeah, everybody go check out The Nightbirds. And yeah, again, Chris, thanks so much for hanging out.
Thank you,
And
Robert. It was great
we'll
chatting.
see everybody else next time. Bye.